almost having difficulty being composed myself. That's how bad this case is.
December 16th, 2024, Omaha, Nebraska. A detective stands outside a Dairy Queen on South 108th Street, and the words that come out of his mouth will haunt everyone who hears them. This is the worst case I've ever seen in my entire career. And this is a man who has spent decades investigating child abuse, homicides, and unspeakable violence. But nothing prepared him for what was found behind that dumpster on a freezing Monday morning. The exterior of the Dairy Queen looks ordinary. It's a commercial strip, the kind you'd drive past without a second thought. But on this particular morning, something was discovered that would expose one of the most catastrophic failures of the child protective system in Nebraska history. A small body, abandoned like trash, left to be found by a stranger who was simply taking out the garbage. This is the story of Dante Campbell, a 7-year-old boy who died alone, and the system that failed him at every single turn. It was approximately 8:47 a.m. when the 911 call came in. An employee at the Dairy Queen had gone outside to dispose of trash from the morning prep. Behind the dumpster, partially concealed by cardboard boxes and debris, they saw something that didn't belong. At first, it wasn't immediately clear what they were looking at. But as they moved closer, the horrifying reality set in. It was a child. A small boy, curled in a fetal position, wearing only a thin t-shirt and underwear in temperatures that had dropped well below freezing the night before. The employee immediately called 911, their voice shaking as they tried to explain what they had found. Within minutes, Omaha Police Department officers arrived on scene, followed shortly by homicide detectives and the medical examiner's office. The area was cordoned off. Yellow crime scene tape surrounded the entire back lot of the Dairy Queen. Investigators began documenting everything, photographing the scene from every angle, collecting evidence, trying to piece together how a child ended up discarded behind a fast food restaurant like he was nothing. The first question investigators had to answer was simple but devastating. Who is this child? He had no identification on him, no wallet, no phone, nothing that could immediately tell them his name or where he came from. But what they could see, even in those first moments, was evidence of prolonged abuse. His body showed signs of severe malnutrition. Bruising in various stages of healing covered his arms, legs, and torso. There were marks consistent with being struck repeatedly. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a tragic mishap. This was the result of sustained, deliberate violence. Detectives began canvassing the area immediately. They spoke to employees at nearby businesses. They pulled surveillance footage from every camera within a 3-block radius. They needed to know when this child was left here, who brought him, and how long he had been lying behind that dumpster before anyone found him. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment suggested the boy had been deceased for at least 12 to 24 hours before discovery, meaning he had been abandoned sometime on December 15th, possibly late at night when the area was deserted and no witnesses would be around. By late afternoon on December 16th, investigators had a breakthrough. Surveillance footage from the Dairy Queen's parking lot showed a vehicle pulling into the rear lot around 2:30 a.m. on December 15th. 2 individuals exited the vehicle, carried something to the area behind the dumpster, and then quickly left. The license plate was captured clearly enough to run through the system. Within hours, detectives had a name, Charlotte Kurek, and attached to her records was a child, Dante Campbell, age 7. When investigators cross-referenced Dante's information with the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services, what they found was staggering. Dante Campbell was not an unknown child to the system. He was not someone who had slipped through the cracks unnoticed. He was a child who had been reported to Child Protective Services multiple times over the course of 2 years. Family members had called. Neighbors had called. Concerned citizens had called, and every single time, those reports were either screened out without investigation or closed after minimal follow-up. Dante Campbell had been crying out for help through the voices of people who cared about him, and the system that was supposed to protect him had turned its back repeatedly. The discovery of Dante Campbell's body sent shockwaves through the Omaha community. Vigils were organized within days. Strangers who had never met Dante showed up with candles, stuffed animals, and flowers, leaving them behind the Dairy Queen where his body had been found. Parents held their children a little tighter that night. Teachers looked at their students with new eyes, wondering if any of them were suffering in silence. Because if Dante could fall through the cracks this completely, if a child could be reported to authorities multiple times and still end up dead behind a dumpster, then how many other children were out there right now, invisible and voiceless, waiting for someone to save them? The Omaha Police Department held a press conference on December 18th. The police chief stood at the podium, visibly shaken, and addressed the media and the public. "We failed this child," he said. "Our community failed this child, and we owe it to Dante Campbell to make sure this never happens again." But those words, as sincere as they might have been, rang hollow to the people who had tried to save Dante while he was still alive. The family members who had called CPS and been dismissed, the neighbors who had reported concerning signs and been told it wasn't enough to warrant intervention. They had done everything right, and Dante still died. So the question that haunted everyone in those early days and continues to haunt us now is this: what is the point of a child protective system if it doesn't actually protect children? Before we go deeper into the timeline of failures that led to Dante's preventable death, I need to ask something of you. This channel exists for one reason: to seek justice for the most vulnerable children, the ones who needed protection but didn't get it. And the only way these stories reach the people who need to hear them, the people who might recognize warning signs, the people who might save a child, is if you help me get them there. So right now, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video. I mean it. Share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter. Send it to someone you know who works with children, or who might be in a position to see these red flags. Every single share could reach someone who needs to understand how these systems fail, and how to fight back when they do. And here's something that really helps. Drop a comment below with your city and what time you're watching this. It sounds simple, but that information helps me understand when to publish investigations like this so they reach the maximum number of people. The algorithm rewards engagement, and engagement means more eyes on these cases, which means more pressure on the systems that are supposed to protect children like Dante. I also want you to know that every case I cover here is a lesson. It's not just about what went wrong. It's about teaching you to recognize danger, to understand the warning signs, to know what questions to ask when something doesn't feel right. So after you finish this video, go watch the others on this channel. Because this knowledge, this awareness, could help you protect a child someday. It could make you the person who doesn't look away, who doesn't assume someone else will handle it, who makes the call that saves a life. And if this work matters to you, if you believe that these children deserve to have their stories told and their deaths investigated, and if you're able to support what I do here, click the Super Thanks button below this video. Every contribution goes directly into better equipment, deeper research, and more time spent on investigations like Dante's. This isn't about me. It's about making sure no child is forgotten, and no system failure goes unexamined. Thank you. Now let's talk about what happened in the 2 years leading up to December 16th, 2024. Once Dante Campbell was identified, investigators had to reconstruct the final 72 hours of his life. What they uncovered was a timeline of neglect, abuse, and ultimately, abandonment that is almost impossible to comprehend. This wasn't a sudden tragedy. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment that spiraled out of control. This was a sustained pattern of cruelty that ended with a 7-year-old boy being thrown away like garbage. Let's start with December 13th, 2024. 3 days before Dante's body was discovered. According to witness statements and surveillance footage, Dante was still alive at this point, living in an apartment on North 36th Street with his mother, Charlotte Kurek, and her boyfriend, Devario Cruz. But the word living needs to be understood in the most basic biological sense, because what was happening inside that apartment was not life as any child should experience it. Neighbors reported hearing crying coming from the apartment regularly, sometimes for hours at a time. One neighbor, who lived directly below the unit, told investigators that they would hear thuds and crashes, followed by a child's voice screaming and pleading. They had called the police twice in the past month. Officers had performed welfare checks both times. Both times Charlotte Kurek answered the door, assured officers that everything was fine, and the officers left without ever seeing Dante. No follow-up, no investigation, just a checkmark in a report that said the call had been addressed. On December 14th, something changed. Multiple witnesses reported not hearing any sounds from the apartment that day. No crying, no movement, nothing. One neighbor later told detectives that the silence was actually more disturbing than the noise had been, because at least when they heard crying, they knew the child was still alive. The silence meant something had gone very, very wrong. By the evening of December 14th, surveillance footage from the apartment complex shows Charlotte Kurek and Devario Cruz leaving the building carrying what appears to be a large black trash bag. They placed it in the trunk of their vehicle and drove away. They returned approximately 45 minutes later without the bag. At 2:30 a.m. on December 15th, that same vehicle is captured on the Dairy Queen surveillance footage, pulling into the rear lot, where two figures exit and move toward the dumpster area. When investigators finally gained access to the apartment on North 36th Street with a search warrant, what they found was a crime scene that spoke volumes about the conditions Dante had been living in. The apartment was filthy. Trash covered the floors. The smell of decay and neglect was overwhelming. But it was Dante's room, if you could even call it that revealed the true horror of his existence. Dante had been kept in a small bedroom with no furniture except a bare mattress on the floor. There were no toys, no books, no signs that a child lived there at all. The walls had holes punched in them. There were locks on the outside of the door, meaning Dante could be locked inside and prevented from leaving. Investigators found dried blood on the mattress and on the floor. They found feces in the corner of the room, suggesting that Dante had been locked in for extended periods without access to a bathroom. This was not a home. This was a prison. And Dante Campbell had been a prisoner in it for months, possibly longer. The medical examiner's report on Dante Campbell is one of the most disturbing documents you will ever read. I'm not going to share every graphic detail here because some things are too horrific to put into words, and because Dante deserves dignity even in death. But there are facts that need to be stated because they illustrate just how badly this child suffered and for how long. Dante weighed 32 pounds at the time of his death. To put that in perspective, the average weight for a 7-year-old boy is between 50 and 60 pounds. Dante weighed barely more than a toddler. His body showed signs of severe, prolonged malnutrition. His ribs were visible. His arms and legs were skeletal. The medical examiner noted that Dante's growth had been stunted, likely due to chronic starvation over an extended period of time. This wasn't a child who had missed a few meals. This was a child who had been systematically starved. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, combined with complications from malnutrition and hypothermia. In other words, Dante had been beaten, he had been starved, and then he had been left outside in freezing temperatures wearing almost nothing. Any one of those things could have killed him. The combination of all three made his death not just inevitable, but agonizing. The injuries documented on Dante's body told the story of months, if not years, of abuse. There were bruises in various stages of healing, indicating that he had been struck repeatedly over time. There were scars, consistent with being burned. There were fractures in his ribs that had healed improperly, suggesting previous injuries that had never received medical attention. The medical examiner noted that some of these injuries were weeks or even months old, meaning that Dante had been suffering for a long time before anyone intervened. And here's what makes this even more unbearable. Every single one of these injuries would have been visible to anyone who saw Dante without clothing. A doctor would have seen them. A social worker would have seen them. A teacher would have seen them. But Dante never went to school. He never saw a doctor. He was kept hidden away, isolated from the world, so that no one could see what was being done to him. I spoke with multiple law enforcement sources who worked on this case, and the emotional toll it took on them is evident in every conversation. These are seasoned investigators, people who have worked homicides, sexual assaults, child abuse cases for years. They've seen terrible things. But Dante Campbell's case broke something in them. One detective, who asked not to be identified by name, told me this: "I have kids. I go home at night and I look at them, and I think about Dante, and I can't reconcile how a child can be treated like that. How someone can look at a 7-year-old boy and decide that his life has no value. I've been doing this job for 18 years, and I've never had a case that haunted me like this one does. Because it wasn't just what happened to him. It's that it could have been prevented. We had chances. The system had chances. And we all failed him." That sentiment, that this was preventable, echoed through every conversation I had with investigators on this case. Because the evidence they were collecting wasn't just about building a criminal case against Charlotte Curick and Devario Cruz. It was also evidence of a massive systemic failure that allowed Dante to suffer for years while people who were supposed to protect him looked the other way. The investigation itself presented unique challenges. In most child abuse cases, there are witnesses, teachers who saw bruises, doctors who documented injuries, family members who can provide testimony about what they observed. But Dante had been completely isolated. He wasn't enrolled in school. He hadn't seen a pediatrician in over 2 years. The people who knew what was happening to him were the same people who were abusing him. So investigators had to build their case almost entirely on physical evidence and the few neighbors who had heard things through the walls. One of the most difficult aspects of the investigation was interviewing the neighbors who had called for help. These were people who had done the right thing. They had heard a child in distress, and they had called the police. They had reported their concerns to Child Protective Services, and now they were being told that the child they had tried to save was dead. One neighbor broke down during her interview with detectives, saying over and over, I called so many times. Why didn't anyone listen? Why didn't anyone check on him?" Detectives had to walk a fine line in these interviews. They needed information, but they also knew these witnesses were traumatized and feeling immense guilt, even though they had done nothing wrong. The guilt belonged to the system that ignored their calls, not to the people who made them. As the investigation progressed, detectives began building a timeline not just of Dante's final days, but of the entire 2 years leading up to his death. They pulled every CPS report that had been filed. They obtained records of every police welfare check. They interviewed family members who had been cut off from contact with Dante. And what emerged was a pattern that investigators described as willful blindness on the part of multiple agencies. One detective put it this way: "We had a child who was being reported to authorities repeatedly. We had family members begging for someone to check on him. We had neighbors calling 911 because they could hear him screaming. And at every single point where intervention could have happened, someone made the decision that it wasn't serious enough, that it didn't meet the threshold, that the family had a right to privacy. Well, Dante Campbell had a right to live. And that right was taken from him because the people whose job it was to protect him decided paperwork and protocol were more important than his life. The emotional toll on the investigative team was severe enough that the Omaha Police Department brought in crisis counselors specifically for the detectives working this case. Several investigators requested temporary reassignment after the case concluded. One detective took early retirement, telling colleagues that after Dante Campbell, he couldn't do this work anymore. The images of that small body behind the dumpster, the photographs of his injuries, the evidence of his suffering, these things don't leave you. They become part of you. And for the men and women who worked this case, Dante Campbell will be with them for the rest of their lives. On December 18, 2024, 48 hours after Dante's body was discovered, Charlotte Kurek was taken into custody at a residence in Council Bluffs, Iowa, just across the state line from Omaha. She had fled there after dumping Dante's body, apparently believing that crossing state lines would somehow protect her from prosecution. It didn't. U.S. Marshals and Omaha Police Department detectives executed the arrest warrant at approximately 6 a.m. According to law enforcement sources, Charlotte Kurek showed no emotion when she was arrested. She didn't ask about Dante. She didn't express remorse. She didn't cry. When detectives informed her that she was being charged in connection with the death of her son, her only response was to ask for a lawyer. That was it. No explanation, no denial, no grief, just silence. DeVario Cruz was arrested later that same day at a separate location in Omaha. Unlike Charlotte, Cruz attempted to flee when officers arrived. He ran out the back door of the residence and was apprehended 3 blocks away after a brief foot chase. When he was brought in for questioning, Cruz initially denied any knowledge of what had happened to Dante. He claimed he barely knew the child, that he had only been dating Charlotte for a few months, that he had nothing to do with any abuse. But the evidence told a different story. Surveillance footage placed Cruz at the apartment regularly. Neighbors identified him as someone who lived there. His fingerprints were found throughout the apartment, including in Dante's room. And most damning of all, his DNA was found on some of the items used to restrain Dante. Cruz's denials fell apart within hours, and eventually, he stopped talking altogether and invoked his right to an attorney. The initial charges filed against both Charlotte Kurek and DeVario Cruz were first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, and abuse of a corpse. These are charges that carry the possibility of life in prison without parole in Nebraska. Prosecutors made it clear from the beginning that they would be seeking the maximum penalties allowed under law. This wasn't a case where plea deals were going to be offered lightly. This was a case where the state intended to hold both defendants fully accountable for every single thing they had done to Dante Campbell. At the press conference announcing the arrests, the Douglas County attorney stood at the podium and said this: "Dante Campbell was 7 years old. He should be in 2nd grade right now, learning to read, playing with friends, living the life every child deserves. Instead, he's dead. He died alone, in pain, and afraid. And the 2 people who were supposed to protect him are the ones who killed him. We will pursue justice for Dante with every resource we have, and we will make sure that the failures that allowed this to happen are exposed and corrected so that no other child suffers the way Dante did." But for the people who had tried to save Dante while he was still alive, those words offered little comfort, because justice for Dante meant he was already gone, and no amount of prison time for his killers would bring him back. Charlotte Marie Kurek was 31 years old when she was arrested for the murder of her son. To understand how a mother could do what she allegedly did to Dante, we need to look at who Charlotte Kurek was and the pattern of behavior that led to December 16, 2024. Charlotte had been involved with Child Protective Services long before Dante's death. In fact, CPS had an open file on her dating back to 2019, when Dante was just 2 years old. The initial report came from a family member who alleged that Charlotte was using drugs and leaving Dante unsupervised for extended periods. A caseworker was assigned. A home visit was conducted. Charlotte denied the allegations, claimed she was getting her life together, and promised to cooperate with services. The case was closed within 3 months with a finding of unsubstantiated. That word, unsubstantiated, appears over and over again in Charlotte's CPS file. In 2020, another report was filed by a neighbor who said they had seen bruises on Dante's arms and face. Unsubstantiated. In 2021, a report came in from a daycare provider who said Dante had arrived with what appeared to be cigarette burns on his hands. Unsubstantiated. In 2022, a family member reported that Charlotte's boyfriend at the time was physically abusive toward both Charlotte and Dante. Unsubstantiated. Each time a caseworker would show up, Charlotte would provide an explanation, and the case would be closed. There was never any follow-up. There was never any pattern analysis to see that these reports were escalating in severity. There was never any consideration that maybe, just maybe, where there's smoke, there's fire. Charlotte's relationship with Dante was complicated by the fact that she had never wanted to be a mother. Multiple family members told investigators that Charlotte had considered giving Dante up for adoption when he was born, but had been pressured by her own mother to keep him. She resented that decision. She resented Dante, and as he got older, that resentment turned into something darker. By 2023, Charlotte had cut off contact with most of her family. Her mother, Dante's grandmother, told investigators that she had tried repeatedly to see Dante, but Charlotte would make excuses, cancel visits, or simply not answer the door. The last time Dante's grandmother saw him was in early 2023, nearly 2 years before his death. She said he looked thin and withdrawn, that he didn't speak or make eye contact, and that when she tried to hug him, he flinched. She reported her concerns to CPS. That report was also marked unsubstantiated. The red flags weren't just missed, they were ignored. Charlotte Kurek had a documented history of neglecting and allegedly abusing her son. She had isolated him from family members who could have protected him. She had moved multiple times, making it harder for authorities to track her. And she had learned exactly what to say to caseworkers to make them go away. She knew the system, and she knew how to game it. One investigator described Charlotte this way: "She's not mentally ill. She's not delusional. She knew exactly what she was doing. She made calculated decisions to hide Dante, to keep him away from people who might help him, and to present a version of herself to authorities that would keep them from looking too closely. This wasn't a mother who lost control. This was a mother who chose, again and again, to harm her child." Davario Lamont Cruz was 28 years old when he was arrested. Unlike Charlotte, who had no prior criminal record, Cruz had an extensive history with law enforcement. He had been arrested multiple times for domestic violence, assault, drug possession, and violation of protection orders. In 2021, he had served 6 months in jail for assaulting a previous girlfriend. In 2022, he violated a no-contact order and was arrested again. Cruz met Charlotte Kurek in late 2023 through mutual friends. According to people who knew them both, the relationship was volatile from the beginning. They fought constantly. Neighbors reported hearing screaming matches that would go on for hours. Police were called to their apartment multiple times for domestic disturbances, though Charlotte never pressed charges, and Cruz was never arrested during these incidents. What's critical to understand about Davario Cruz is that he was not Dante's father, and he had no legal relationship to the child. He was Charlotte's boyfriend. He had no parental rights, no custody, no authority over Dante whatsoever. And yet, according to the evidence collected by investigators, Cruz took an active role in allegedly abusing Dante, and Charlotte allowed it to happen. Witnesses told investigators that Cruz was openly hostile toward Dante. One neighbor recalled hearing Cruz yelling at the child, calling him names, threatening him. Another neighbor said they saw Cruz grab Dante by the arm and drag him into the apartment while the boy was crying. When this neighbor confronted Charlotte about it later, Charlotte allegedly said. "He's just trying to discipline him. Dante needs a father figure." But what Cruz provided wasn't discipline. It was terror. According to the evidence presented in court filings, Cruz allegedly participated in the systematic abuse of Dante Campbell. He allegedly struck the child. He allegedly withheld food as punishment. He allegedly locked Dante in his room for extended periods. And Charlotte, rather than protecting her son, enabled Cruz's behavior and participated in it herself. One of the most disturbing aspects of Cruz's involvement is that he had no emotional connection to Dante. No history with him. No reason to care about him. He was simply a man who entered this child's life and allegedly decided that Dante was an inconvenience, a burden, something to be controlled and punished. And when Dante died, Cruz allegedly helped dispose of his body, as if he were nothing more than trash. Cruz's criminal history shows a pattern of violence against vulnerable people, women, children, anyone he perceived as weaker than himself. He's a predator, and Charlotte Kurek brought him into her son's life and gave him access to a child who had no way to defend himself. The abuse of Dante Campbell didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual escalation that began with neglect and evolved into systematic torture. Understanding this progression is important because it shows how abuse can intensify when there's no intervention, and how perpetrators become emboldened when they face no consequences. In the early stages, the abuse was primarily neglect. Dante wasn't being fed regularly. He wasn't being taken to doctor's appointments. He wasn't being enrolled in school. Charlotte would leave him alone in the apartment for hours while she went out. These are serious forms of abuse, but they're also the kinds of things that can be explained away or minimized by someone who doesn't want to see what's really happening. But by late 2023, after Cruz entered the picture, the abuse became more active and more violent. According to evidence presented in court documents, Dante was being struck with objects, belts, wooden spoons, extension cords. He was being burned with cigarettes. He was being locked in his room without food or water for days at a time. The medical examiner's report documented injuries that were consistent with being kicked, punched, and thrown against walls. The pattern that emerges from the evidence is one of increasing cruelty. Each act of violence that went unpunished led to another, more severe act. Each time Charlotte and Cruz got away with hurting Dante, they felt more comfortable escalating the abuse. And because Dante was completely isolated, no school, no doctors, no contact with family, there was no one to stop them. One of the questions investigators struggled with was why the abuse continued to escalate. Why wasn't neglect enough? Why did it have to become physical violence, and then torture, and then murder? The answer, according to forensic psychologists consulted on the case, is that perpetrators of child abuse often experience a psychological phenomenon where the victim becomes dehumanized. Dante stopped being a child to Charlotte and Cruz. He became an object, a problem, something that existed only to frustrate them and require their attention. When you dehumanize someone, it becomes easier to hurt them. It becomes easier to justify the violence, and it becomes easier to convince yourself that what you're doing isn't really that bad, because the victim isn't really a person anymore. That's what happened to Dante. In the minds of his abusers, he wasn't a 7-year-old boy who deserved love and protection. He was an inconvenience that needed to be controlled. The evidence collected by investigators paints a picture of abuse that became increasingly systematic and sadistic. According to court documents, Dante was being punished for things that no child should ever be punished for: crying, asking for food, making noise, simply existing. The punishments were disproportionate and cruel. He was allegedly locked in his room for days at a time with no food or water. He was allegedly forced to stand in corners for hours until he collapsed from exhaustion. He was allegedly beaten for wetting himself, even though he was being denied access to the bathroom. Neighbors who lived in the apartment complex told investigators they would hear sounds coming from Charlotte's apartment that haunted them. Thuds against walls, a child crying and begging, adult voices screaming obscenities. One neighbor said they heard what sounded like furniture being thrown, followed by a child's scream that was suddenly cut off. That neighbor called the police. Officers responded, knocked on the door, spoke briefly with Charlotte, and left. No welfare check on Dante was conducted. No follow-up report was filed. The medical examiner's report documented injuries that told the story of prolonged, repeated abuse. Dante had fractures in various stages of healing, indicating he had been injured multiple times over an extended period. He had scars consistent with cigarette burns. He had ligature marks on his wrists and ankles, suggesting he had been restrained. He had bruises covering his body in patterns consistent with being struck with objects and with fists. And he was severely malnourished, weighing only 38 pounds when he died, approximately 30 pounds less than the average weight for a 7-year-old boy. But perhaps the most damning evidence of the escalation of abuse was found in text messages between Charlotte Kurek and Devario Cruz. In messages recovered from their phones, they discussed Dante in terms that are difficult to even repeat. They called him names. They joked about punishing him. They expressed frustration that he wouldn't just shut up and behave. In one message, Charlotte allegedly wrote to Cruz, "I'm so tired of dealing with him. He ruins everything." Cruz allegedly responded, "Then stop letting him ruin things. Make him understand." What "make him understand" meant, according to prosecutors, was escalating violence designed to break Dante's spirit completely. It meant punishing him not just for misbehavior, but for being alive. It meant creating an environment where a 7-year-old child lived in constant terror, never knowing when the next beating would come, never knowing if he would be fed that day, never knowing if anyone would ever come to save him. The abuse escalated because it could, because no one stopped it, because every time Charlotte and Cruz hurt Dante and faced no consequences, they learned that they could hurt him more. They learned that no one was watching. They learned that no one cared. And so the abuse continued and intensified until it reached the point where Dante Campbell's small body simply couldn't take any more. One investigator described it this way: "This wasn't a parent who lost their temper one time and made a terrible mistake. This was a sustained campaign of torture against a defenseless child. This was deliberate. This was intentional. And this was preventable at every single stage." The final days of Dante Campbell's life represent the culmination of years of abuse and the complete breakdown of any humanity his mother and her boyfriend might have once possessed. What allegedly happened between December 13th and December 16th, 2024, is almost incomprehensible in its cruelty. According to the criminal complaint and evidence presented to the grand jury, on December 13th, Dante was still alive but in critical condition. He had been beaten severely, allegedly by both Charlotte Kurek and Devario Cruz. The medical examiner would later determine that the blunt force trauma to his head occurred during this time period. Dante had a skull fracture. He was likely suffering from a severe concussion, possibly bleeding in his brain. He needed immediate medical attention. Instead, he was locked in his room and left alone. For the next 48 to 72 hours, Dante Campbell lay dying in that room, while his mother and her boyfriend went about their lives. Surveillance footage shows Charlotte and Cruz leaving the apartment multiple times during this period, going to convenience stores, visiting friends, living as if nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, Dante was alone, in agony, slowly dying from his injuries and from starvation and dehydration. On the evening of December 15th, according to the prosecution's timeline, Charlotte checked on Dante and found him unresponsive. Rather than calling 911, rather than seeking help, Rather than doing anything a mother should do when her child is dying, Charlotte allegedly made a decision. She decided that Dante was already dead or would be soon, and that the priority was not saving him, but hiding what she and Cruz had done. This is where the alleged actions become even more depraved. Instead of calling for help, Charlotte allegedly told Cruz that they needed to get rid of him. Together, they allegedly wrapped Dante's body, and investigators believe he may have still been alive at this point, barely clinging to life, in plastic bags and blankets. They placed him in a large black trash bag. Surveillance footage from the apartment complex shows them carrying something large and heavy to their vehicle at approximately 10:15 p.m. on December 15th. They drove around for hours, according to cell phone location data, trying to decide where to dispose of Dante's body. They considered several locations. They allegedly discussed dumping him in the Missouri River. They allegedly considered burying him in a remote area outside the city. But ultimately, they chose the dumpster behind the Dairy Queen on North 72nd Street. At 1:47 a.m. on December 16th, surveillance cameras captured their vehicle pulling into the rear parking lot of the Dairy Queen. Two figures exit the vehicle. One opens the trunk. Together, they carry something to the dumpster enclosure. They're there for approximately 3.5 minutes. Then they return to the vehicle and drive away. What garbage! While the two people who were supposed to protect him drove home and went to sleep. That's what Charlotte Kurek and Deverio Cruz allegedly did to a 7-year-old child. They beat him. They starved him. They terrorized him. And when his small body finally gave out from the abuse, they threw him in a dumpster and tried to pretend he never existed. The Douglas County attorney called it one of the most depraved acts of child abuse his office had ever prosecuted. The lead detective on the case said in his testimony that in 23 years of law enforcement, he had never seen a case that affected him more deeply. And the judge who presided over the preliminary hearing said that the evidence presented was beyond disturbing. It represents a complete moral failure by the adults responsible for this child's safety. Charlotte Kurek and Deverio Cruz are facing multiple charges: first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. If convicted on all counts, they face life in prison without the possibility of parole. The prosecution has indicated they will seek the maximum sentence for both defendants. But no sentence, no matter how severe, will bring Dante Campbell back. No punishment will undo the years of suffering he endured. And no justice system can truly account for the complete and utter failure of every adult who had the power to save him and chose not to. Now we need to talk about the part of this story that makes it almost impossible to bear. Because Dante Campbell didn't die in silence. He didn't suffer in secret. People knew, people saw, people reported, and the system that was supposed to protect him did nothing. Let's go through the timeline of reports made to Child Protective Services about Dante Campbell. February 2020, Dante's paternal grandmother contacts CPS. She reports that Dante appears malnourished, that he has visible bruises, and that she's deeply concerned about his living conditions. She provides specific details about what she's observed during visits. The report is screened out. No investigation is opened. May 2020. A family member calls again. This time they report that Dante is being isolated from the family, that Charlotte won't allow visits, and that when they do see him briefly, he looks thin and frightened. They express concern that he's being abused. The report is screened out. No investigation is opened. August 2020. Another call to CPS. This time the caller reports that Dante has visible injuries, that he's losing weight, and that something is seriously wrong in that home. They beg CPS to do a welfare check. The report is screened out. No investigation is opened. October 2020. A relative makes what would be the final report before Dante's death. They tell CPS that Dante looks skeletal, that he has bruises and marks on his body, that he seems terrified, and that they believe his life is in danger. They provide Charlotte's address. They ask, they plead, for someone to check on this child. The report is screened out. No investigation is opened. 2 months later, Dante Campbell was dead. 4 separate reports, 4 separate warnings, 4 opportunities to save a child's life, and every single one was dismissed without investigation. So the question becomes, how does this happen? How do 4 reports about a child who is visibly suffering get screened out without anyone ever laying eyes on that child? To understand that, we need to understand how Child Protective Services operates, and, more importantly, how it's failing. When a report comes into CPS, it doesn't automatically trigger an investigation. Instead, it goes through what's called a screening process. A CPS worker reviews the information provided and makes a decision. Does this report meet the threshold for investigation, or does it get screened out? In Wisconsin, the threshold is supposed to be whether there's reason to believe a child is being abused or neglected. But here's the reality. In 2020, the year Dante died, 71% of all CPS reports in Wisconsin were screened out without investigation. 71%. That means that for every 10 calls made to protect a child, 7 of those children never had anyone check on them. 7 of those reports were dismissed based solely on a phone call, without anyone ever seeing the child, visiting the home, or speaking to the family. And it gets worse, because the workers making these screening decisions, they're overwhelmed, understaffed, and drowning in cases. In 2020, Wisconsin had a CPS worker shortage crisis. Workers were carrying caseloads double or triple what's considered safe. They were working mandatory overtime. They were burning out and quitting at record rates, and they were making life or death decisions about children they would never meet, based on reports they had minutes, not hours, to review. The screening process that was supposed to protect children had become a bottleneck, and children like Dante Campbell were falling through the cracks. But here's what makes this even more inexcusable. The reports about Dante weren't vague. They weren't anonymous tips with no details. These were reports from family members who knew Dante, who had seen him, who could describe specific injuries and specific concerns. These were reports that included an address, a name, and a clear pattern of escalating abuse. And still, every single one was screened out. The decision-making process broke down at every level. The workers who screened these reports either didn't recognize the severity of what they were reading, or they were so overwhelmed that they couldn't prioritize a case that should have been an immediate red flag. The supervisors who should have been reviewing these decisions either weren't doing their jobs, or they were just as overwhelmed as the frontline workers. And Dante Campbell paid for that failure with his life. Dante's case isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a system in crisis. Let me give you some numbers that should horrify you. In 2020, the year Dante died, 27 children died from abuse or neglect in Wisconsin. 27 children who were supposed to be protected by the system. And in many of those cases, just like Dante's, there had been prior reports to CPS that were either screened out or inadequately investigated. Wisconsin's child welfare system has been in crisis for years. A 2019 audit by the Legislative Audit Bureau found serious deficiencies in how the state was protecting children. The audit documented chronic understaffing that left workers with unmanageable caseloads, inadequate training for new workers making life or death decisions, poor supervision and quality control, a screening process that was rejecting the majority of reports without investigation, a lack of accountability when children died after reports were ignored. The audit made dozens of recommendations for reform, and by 2020, when Dante died, very few of those recommendations had been implemented. The state knew the system was broken. Advocates had been sounding the alarm for years. Workers themselves were begging for help, for more staff, for better training, for a system that would actually allow them to do their jobs. And children kept dying. After Dante's death, The Douglas County Department of Health and Human Services conducted an internal review. That review found that the reports about Dante should have been investigated. It found that the screening decisions were incorrect. It found that if proper procedures had been followed, Dante Campbell would likely still be alive. But that review came too late. It came after Dante was already in the ground. It came after his grandmother had already buried a child she tried desperately to save. It came after Charlotte Kurek and Devario Cruz had already been arrested and charged with his murder. The review changed nothing for Dante, and for the families still trying to get CPS to respond to their reports, it changed very little for them either. Because here's the truth about system failures. They don't happen in a vacuum. When a child dies after multiple ignored CPS reports, it's not just one worker who failed. It's not just one bad decision. It's an entire system that has been allowed to deteriorate to the point where children's lives are treated as acceptable losses. Wisconsin isn't alone in this crisis. Across the country, child welfare systems are understaffed, underfunded, and overwhelmed. Workers are leaving the field in record numbers because the job has become impossible. And the children who need protection the most are the ones paying the price. So, where do we go from here? What happens now that Dante Campbell is dead and the system that failed him has been exposed? After Dante's death, the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families launched an investigation into how Douglas County CPS handled, or failed to handle, the reports about him. That investigation is still ongoing as of this recording. But here's what we know needs to change, based not just on Dante's case, but on the dozens of similar cases across Wisconsin and the country. First, CPS needs adequate staffing. Workers can't make sound decisions about child safety when they're drowning in cases. The 71% screen-out rate isn't a sign of workers being lazy. It's a sign of a system so overwhelmed that it can't function. Second, the screening process needs reform. When multiple reports come in about the same child, that should trigger an automatic escalation. When family members provide specific details about visible injuries and malnutrition, that should require an in-person welfare check, not a phone screening. Third, there needs to be accountability when the system fails. Not just internal reviews that come too late, but real consequences when children die after being reported to CPS. Supervisors who fail to properly oversee their workers. Administrators who ignore warnings about system failures. Legislators who refuse to fund child protection adequately. Fourth, mandatory reporters, teachers, doctors, daycare workers need better training on what to report and how to follow up when their reports are screened out. Because in Dante's case, the family members who reported weren't mandatory reporters. They were relatives who loved him and were watching him die. And the system gave them no recourse when their reports were ignored. And finally, we need to stop accepting child deaths as inevitable. 27 children died in Wisconsin in 2020 from abuse or neglect. That's not a statistic. That's 27 children who should still be alive. 27 families destroyed. 27 futures stolen. Dante Campbell's case isn't unique. Just months after his death, another Wisconsin child, 3-year-old Elijah Vu, disappeared under suspicious circumstances. His case also involved prior CPS contact. His case also involved a system that failed to protect him. The pattern is clear. The failures are documented. The solutions are known. What's missing is the political will to prioritize children's lives over budget concerns. What's missing is a society that treats child protection as the emergency it is. Dante Campbell deserved better. He deserved a system that responded when his family begged for help. He deserved adults who put his safety above their convenience. He deserved to grow up, to go to school, to have friends, to live. Instead, he got a system that looked the other way while he suffered. And when he died, that same system conducted reviews and investigations that will do nothing to bring him back. The question now is, how many more children have to die before we fix this? On December 10, 2020, Charlotte Kurek and Davario Cruz were arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide in the death of Dante Campbell. Let me be clear about what that charge means. First-degree intentional homicide is the most serious charge in Wisconsin law. It means prosecutors believe that Charlotte and Davario didn't just neglect Dante. They didn't just fail to get him medical care. Prosecutors allege that they intentionally caused his death, that their actions were deliberate, calculated, and designed to kill him. If convicted, both face mandatory life sentences in prison. But the homicide charge isn't the only charge they're facing. Both Charlotte and Davario were also charged with chronic child abuse causing death. This charge specifically addresses the pattern of abuse, the months of starvation, the beatings, the torture that Dante endured before his death. And there's another charge, child neglect causing death. This charge addresses their alleged failure to provide Dante with basic necessities, food, water, medical care, safety. Each of these charges carries its own potential sentence. Combined, if convicted on all counts, Charlotte Kurek and Davario Cruz would spend the rest of their lives in prison. The criminal complaint filed by prosecutors lays out the evidence in devastating detail. The autopsy findings, the statements from family members who tried to report the abuse, the condition of Dante's body when he was found, the evidence of prolonged starvation and physical trauma. It's a document that's difficult to read, but it's also a document that makes the state's case clear. Dante Campbell didn't die by accident. He didn't die from neglect alone. According to prosecutors, he was murdered, slowly, deliberately, and cruelly, by the two people who were supposed to care for him. When Charlotte Kurek and Davario Cruz made their first court appearance, even the court commissioner, someone who sees criminal cases every single day, couldn't hide his reaction to what he was reading. Court Commissioner Douglas Finn, after reviewing the criminal complaint, stated on the record, "This is one of the most disturbing cases I have seen in my time on the bench." Let that sink in. A court official who has presided over countless criminal cases, murders, assaults, abuse cases, called Dante's case one of the most disturbing he'd ever seen. Both Charlotte and Davario were ordered held on $1 million cash bond. That's not a bond they can pay 10% of. That's $1 million in cash, which means they're not getting out of jail while they await trial. The preliminary hearing is scheduled for October 29, 2024. That's the hearing where a judge will determine whether there's enough evidence to proceed to trial. Given the strength of the evidence, the autopsy, the medical examiner's findings, the photographs, the statements, it's almost certain this case will move forward. After the preliminary hearing, the case will move through the court system. There will be pre-trial motions. There may be plea negotiations, though given the severity of the charges, it's unclear whether prosecutors would be willing to offer any kind of deal. And eventually, if the case doesn't result in a plea agreement, there will be a trial. A jury will hear the evidence. They'll see the photographs of Dante's body. They'll hear from the medical examiner about how he died. They'll hear from family members who tried desperately to save him. And then they'll decide. Are Charlotte Kurek and Davario Cruz guilty of murdering Dante Campbell? The legal process will take time. It could be months or even years before this case is fully resolved. But one thing is certain. Dante Campbell's story will be told in that courtroom. His suffering will be documented, and the people allegedly responsible for his death will face justice. If you've made it this far in this video, I need you to hear this next part, because Dante's story doesn't have to be repeated. Right now, there is a child somewhere who is suffering the way Dante suffered. There is a child who is being starved, beaten, isolated, and tortured. And there is someone, maybe a neighbor, maybe a teacher, maybe a family member, who suspects something is wrong but doesn't know what to do. If that person is you, here's what you do. Call the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-422-4453. That number is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The call is free. You can remain anonymous, and trained counselors will help you report suspected abuse to the appropriate authorities. You don't need proof. You don't need to be certain. If you see a child who looks malnourished, who has unexplained injuries, who seems terrified of their caregivers, who is being isolated from family and friends, call. Let the professionals investigate. Let them determine whether intervention is needed. Because here's the truth. It's better to make a report that turns out to be nothing than to stay silent while a child dies. Dante's family made those calls. They reported what they saw, and the system failed them. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't report. It means we need to fix the system so that when people do report, children actually get help. Which brings me to the second part of this call to action. CPS reform. If you live in Wisconsin, contact your state legislators. Tell them that the child welfare system needs adequate funding. Tell them that CPS workers need manageable caseloads. Tell them that the 71% screen-out rate is unacceptable. Tell them that 27 child deaths in 1 year is 27 too many. You can find your Wisconsin state legislators at legs.wisconsin.gov. Send them an email, make a phone call, show up at town halls. Make it clear that child protection is a priority and that you're paying attention to how they vote on funding and reform. And if you don't live in Wisconsin, check your own state's child welfare statistics. I guarantee you'll find similar problems. I guarantee there are children in your state who are falling through the cracks. Contact your own legislators. Demand reform. Demand accountability. Demand that children's lives be treated as the priority they should be. This isn't a political issue. This isn't about left or right, conservative or progressive. This is about whether we, as a society, are willing to protect the most vulnerable among us. This is about whether a child's life matters more than a budget line item. Dante Campbell is dead because the system failed. But the next child doesn't have to die. The next family doesn't have to bury a child they tried desperately to save. You have power here. Your voice matters. Your report could save a life. Your call to a legislator could change policy. Your refusal to look away could be the difference between a child who suffers in silence and a child who gets help. Don't let Dante's death be meaningless. Let it be the catalyst for change. Dante Campbell was 5 years old when he died. He should be 9 years old right now. He should be in 4th grade. He should be playing with friends, learning to read chapter books, discovering what he loves, figuring out who he wants to be. Instead, he's a name in a case file, a statistic in a child welfare report, a story that people watch on YouTube and then move on from. But I don't want you to move on. I want you to remember his name. Dante Campbell. Say it out loud. Remember that he was real. Remember that he suffered. Remember that he died because adults failed him, not just his abusers, but the system that was supposed to protect him. And then I want you to do something about it. Report suspected abuse. Advocate for CPS reform. Refuse to accept that children dying from abuse is just the way things are. Because it doesn't have to be. The preliminary hearing in this case is scheduled for October 29, 2024. I'll be following the court proceedings and providing updates as this case moves through the legal system. If you want to stay informed about what happens to Charlotte Currick and Devario Cruz, if you want to know whether justice is served for Dante, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. But more than that, if you care about preventing the next tragedy, share this video. Let Dante's story reach people who have the power to change things. Let it reach the neighbor who suspects abuse but hasn't called. Let it reach the legislator who needs to hear that their constituents demand CPS reform. Dante Campbell's voice was silenced, but ours doesn't have to be. Remember his name. Fight for change. And never, ever look away. Rest in peace, Dante. You deserved so much better.